Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole, and today I am going to be revisiting all the books that I was thinking about unhauling in the month of December. Well, really, it was just all the books that I was considering unhauling at the end of last year. So it's been a year since I made a video about this. I'll put the video in the description box below in case you'd like to watch it. And I'd really just like to go back and re-examine and consider the things that I was thinking about unhauling. See, did I actually ever end up unhauling them? Did I read them? Do I still own them? Or what's going on? I really want to use the month of December to sort of clear out all my projects and catch up on all the things and reevaluate, books and that kind of stuff. And I thought that this would be a really good place to start. Now, granted, it's not December yet, but the reason I'm doing this video now is because I realized if I do have books on this list that I haven't read yet, my best chance of getting them done is to know that before I create my December TBR video. So here we are. Let's go ahead and just jump right into it. I am going to discuss the books in the same order that I talked about them in that original video. So the first book that I mentioned is The Far Pavilions. I do still own that book. It is right here. And I have not read it yet. The reason that I was considering unhauling this book is because it is a book where there's like no middle margins. So the text goes right into the crack of the book, and it just makes it difficult to read, and it's kind of hard on the hands because of that. However, that's actually not the reason I haven't read it. It just hasn't come up in my TBR game, or if it did, it was in a month where I already had a lot of books to read, and so I kind of avoided it more for that reason. I am still interested in rereading this book and trying to work with the way the text is outlined. So for now, it's just going to go on the, yep, I'm still interested in reading it. I'm going to hold on to it. Is it still at risk of being unhauled? Yes, but I don't mind that going into next year. The next book was In Pursuit of Jefferson, which was a nonfiction story that kind of reminded me of Bill Bryson's style of talking about like his own accounts of wandering around and this and that. I did end up unhauling this book. I'm pretty sure it ended up being unhauled before I moved, because I just felt like it was a story that maybe I just really wasn't that interested in reading in. I picked it up when going to visit Jefferson's home with my son during 2021 or the end of 2020, something like that. I have good memories with the book, but that's not a reason to keep it, especially if I'm not that interested in reading it. The next book was When I Was Puerto Rican, and I think I mentioned in that video that that's actually my husband's book, and I was interested in reading it. At the time, I was trying to keep all my books on one bookshelf, even though I had multiple bookshelves of books. I don't know why. There was just one place I was trying to keep them, and they weren't all fitting, and so that was also part of the reason that I was considering unhauling some of these. I did end up just reorganizing my bookshelves so that I could have more books on them. I don't know what that was all about. But anyway, so because of that, at the time I was considering unhauling this book. I did unhaul it, which was really, I just gave it back to my husband and had him put it on his shelf. I also had Kaye, I think that's how you pronounce the name of this book, which was a historical fiction. I did unhaul this eventually. I have heard really good things about this book, but I realized at the end of the day that I'm just not a big historical fiction reader, and so they tend to be books that when they're on my shelf, I just kind of work around them and avoid them and end up not reading them. So this was definitely one of the books that I thought, I can let this go. I see it all the time at a used bookstore. I know I can get it out of my library. There's no point in my moving with it. There was the signature of all things. This book was absolutely hilarious that I even owned it. In the middle of filming that video, I had to insert an edit because I realized that the reason I was having a disconnect with this book was because I was looking for a different book and had gotten the author's last name or maybe entire name wrong. And so I ended up with the signature of all things. That was not part of the series I was looking for. And so at first I was like, well, maybe I'll try reading it anyway. In the end, I was like, I don't actually want to read this book. It's not the correct book. And I unhauled it. The next two books, The Revolution of Marina M and Abundance, were two books that I was just on the fence about. The Revolution of Marina M was one that also just kind of went the way of a lot of my historical fiction, where I was like, I don't think I actually want to read this. I'm not as into historical fiction as I was at the time when I got it. And Abundance was one that I tried and realized that I'm just not a huge fan of the author's writing style. And so even though I picked it up and tried a chapter a couple of times, I never wanted to finish the chapter, let alone the rest of the book. I owned The Devil in the White City, and I went back and forth about whether I wanted to read this. And then about partway through the year, I hit a point where I just realized that I don't like a lot of gore and gruesomeness in my stories, and just heavy, like, true crime type of topics just tend to emotionally bring me down. And so once I realized that, I actually unhauled quite a few books that had that feel to them, and this was one of them. The House Girl was yet again another book that just fell into that category of books that I hauled when I was looking more into historical fiction, and one that yet again, when it came time to, decide what I was going to actually move with versus unhauled, this was a book that I let go of because I just realized it wasn't a priority read for me. The Miniturist is one that I again have gone back and forth about a bit. I know there's a lot of people who really like this story, but it's in a genre, yet again, that's kind of outside my comfort zone. It's a book that I would tend to avoid because of that. And then I finally just accepted the fact that it's really easy to get at my library. So I didn't need to move with it and potentially never read it, so I let it go. The next book I mentioned is Tirant Blanc. I do still own this book. Ooh, sorry, it's very shiny. And this is a classic from medieval times, sort of a Knights of the Round Table type of feel, and it's the language and the writing style that I'm not sure I'm going to enjoy, and that makes me go, not sure. I've almost unhauled this book multiple times, but it keeps coming up in other books that I've read or in writing about early classics that were influential, so I really just want to hold on to it until I finally give it a try and see whether or not I actually like it. So it's unread, but I am going to continue to hold on to it. Soul Mountain was another book on this list, and I think it just did not make the move. It got cut before I started packing books because I just thought, is this one that I really want to take with me? Am I really interested in the type of story that this is going to tell? And ultimately, I was just kind of on the fence and again decided, let me unhaul this and get it from the library should the occasion arise where I really want to read this book. The next book that I mentioned is Quicksilver by Neal Stephenson, and I do still own this book. This is the first volume of the Baroque cycle. In the past year, I have actually picked up, it was either book 2 or 3 I found in this series, and I have had a lot of people say that this is worth reading, that it does read slightly different than his more heavier science fiction, and a couple of people have mentioned that they do think I would like this, so this is definitely one that's going to stay on my shelves, even though I haven't read it. And I will admit that I have had Q come up in my TBR game a couple of times, and I've kind of chosen other books other than this, but I think this next year may be the year where I finally get to it. The Night Watchman is a book that did come off of my list. It moved over at one point to my Pulitzer Prize Project list, and then I did try a chapter with those books, and that was one of the books that I just decided to let go. Again, I can get it from the library if I decide to ever come back to it. Perdido Street Station was a book that I just ended up feeling like was not my particular style, was a type of science fiction that was very heavy in the, philosophical science fiction side. I don't know. There's a type of hardcore science fiction that is just not me. I'm just not that interested in that genre to want to go that deep into it. And I had heard a lot of things about how aspects of Perdido Street Station make it confusing and difficult to read and not for everybody. And given that I'm not a huge science fiction fan to begin with, it just didn't make sense for me to try that as a challenge. I did unhaul The Other Black Girl. It was a book that I was going to be able to return and get a decent amount of money for, and I had originally only bought the book because I thought it was one that my family might want to read in our family book club. As of the summer, we actually ended the family book club for the remainder of the year. We will pick it up again in January, but I didn't want to move the book for the one day maybe we would read it. And finally, that brings me to the first book off this list that I have actually read, and that was Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. So I did a buddy read earlier this year with Coda, and we had a great time discussing this book and going, what is happening, and are we enjoying this, and all the kind of things. It ended up being an okay read for me, and interestingly enough, even though I read it, I did end up unhauling it. And that's not because of any particular reason other than the fact that I was moving, and one of the rules that I had made for my move was that I was only going to move with me books that I've read that were 5-star reads, and this was not one of them. The next book on this list that was at risk of being unhauled is March, and I do have that right here. This is by Geraldine Brooks. I did figure out when I was looking over my Pulitzer Prize project books that the reason I was considering unhauling this is because I thought it was by the same author as Gilead. I still have no idea why I thought those were the same two authors. I think because they won Pulitzer Prizes back to back, and I thought it was the same author winning again. I don't know. Either way, it's not by the author of Gilead. It's a completely different author. And I did try the first chapter of this book and kept reading and really enjoyed it. So I really want to get back to this book at some point. So after December, this book is definitely coming off the at risk of being unhauled list. The Lincoln Highway by A. Martorell. I have not read any of his works. I have heard a lot about his writing and that it's very good. And this is just one that I've had an opportunity to pick it up, but just keep kind of avoiding for reasons I don't really know. I think there was one time where it did make it on my TBR and I didn't end up reading it for a variety of different reasons. I think it just isn't a story that I'm super interested in right off the bat, and so I just kind of drag my feet in reading it. I do own and really want to read A Gentleman in Moscow, so there is a part of me that's thinking maybe I just need to let this book go, because again, I could get it at the library, and it's not a book that strikes me as one that would be a 5-star read for me, but I hesitate because I do have a nice hardback copy of it, and if it's a 5-star read, I would want a hardback edition of it. So I don't know. For now, it's unread, but yeah, we'll see what happens. I had an edition of The Underworld that I really liked, and I've tried picking up that book multiple times to read it, and I don't know. It just doesn't do it for me. I just don't find myself really wanting to read the book. I did eventually unhaul it, which was a hard decision to make because there is a cover on the book that they no longer publish it with that has the Twin Towers on it. And so for that reason, I kind of wanted to keep it, but then I really didn't want to move with a book that I had no intention of ever reading. So I unhauled it. The next book on the list was The Fortunes of Richard Mahoney, and I do still own that book. I'm not sure why at the time I wasn't particularly interested in reading this. I don't think I knew a lot about the book. Since then, this is another book that has actually been mentioned in a few other books that I've read, and so my curiosity has been more piqued in this. I cannot for the life of me recall why this book was mentioned in other books or what books those were. But I do want to read this classic, and yeah, so it is definitely staying on my shelves. And by on my shelves, I mean my potential shelves, because as you can see, my books currently are just on the floor. The next book I unhauled was Catherine, and this is one that right after I mentioned unhauling it, I had somebody say, no, don't unhaul it, it's really good. And I mentioned to them that the reason I unhauled it was that she definitely does a good job of using dialect that would have been historically correct at the time, but I was not anticipating that as part of the read, and so it really kind of threw me off from the read. This, however, is a book that I find is pretty easy to find in used bookstores, as well as very easy to get from the library, so while I have added it back onto my TBR list of books to read, I still don't regret actually physically unhauling the book. I did end up unhauling Hantayo. This was a book that from the beginning I wasn't sure if I was going to like because it just had to do with somebody outside a particular people group trying to write first person about that people group. I did some more research on it. It seemed like the culture of the book and the people in it was not well researched, and I just didn't feel like getting into that again because that tends to lead to my having a whole book project, and this was not a book I felt like doing a book project on. I didn't bring it over for some reason, but I do still own Things We Lost to Water, and I think I just forgot to grab it. I have not unhauled it, and I have not read it. I still have no plans to read it anytime soon, and I'm struggling to remember why I bought it to begin with. It is, I think, on one of my other project lists, so maybe at some point I'll pick it up, so we'll see. I did Unhaul The Power of One. Again, I think this was a book that I purchased back in my, I think I really like historical fiction days and bought more books in that genre. And again, was just one that I was ultimately like, I'm sure this is a great book, but this is just not a genre that I tend to go for on a regular basis. Next up was The Golden Bowl by Henry James. I do still own this book. It is still unread. This is one that fell into the category of I was trying to squeeze all my books onto this one bookshelf. Mainly because it was in the room that I was filming in, and for some reason I thought that would be convenient. Don't ask, I have no idea. And so I didn't have any more room on the shelf that this book was on, and so I had decided I had to pick one book to unhaul from that shelf so they'd all fit, and this ended up being it. I no longer have that problem. I ceased to have that problem even before we moved. All I did was condense books I had on a different shelf in a different room and change my filming location and blah, blah, blah. It worked out, is what I'm trying to say. So that is a book that is no longer going to be on the at risk of being unhauled list. We'll see if I pull it in the month of December or not. Next up on the list is Evelina, and I do still own that book. It is right here, and it is still unread. I have had a lot of recommendations to read Frances Burney. I still have not read her. This is the only work of hers that I tried. Again, it was either this or Cecilia, and one of them I liked better than the other. However, since making that previous video, I have decided that this is a book that I do really want to give a try, and so it will probably come off this at-risk list, and yeah, we'll see if I pick it up in December or not, but I will be curious to see my thoughts on Evelina whenever I finally get to it. I did have a Everyman's Library edition of the book that I will put on the screen because I don't even know what it was called or the author's name because I didn't actually say it in the video. And this was before I started listing books in the description box, which if you didn't know, every time I do a video where I list a whole bunch of books, I try to always put their names and authors in the description box below so that it's easy for you to go back and look at what I was talking about. That said, I did unhaul this book because it was a hardback book. It was one that I just bought because of the Everyman's Library edition hardback and not because I was actually interested in reading the author, and I decided that I didn't want to move that book just for that reason. Brave New World, I believe, again, I mentioned in the video that I was probably just going to unhaul and put on my husband's bookshelf. I did do that. I can still pick it up and read it anytime I want. It is still on my TBR list. That brings us to the second book off this list that I actually read this year, and surprisingly, it was The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This was one of the books that I was most sure I was going to actually unhaul and not read. The funny part of it is that I did actually unhaul it back to a little free library because I'm pretty sure that's where I got that edition, but later decided to read the book and rehauled it from a different little free library. So does that count as an unhaul? I don't know, but I read it and I do still own the edition that I read. So I'll just say I read it. And the final book in this list was Cryptonomicon by Neal Stephenson. And I mentioned again, this kind of being in sort of the harder sci-fi category of like, I don't know, just difficult to read and comprehend and follow kind of sci-fi. And I did unhaul this along with Perdido Street Station because both of those are books that are pretty popular and I'm sure somebody else would love to read and get a used edition of way more than I would. All right, so that brings us to the end of the very long list of books I was considering unhauling. I'm rather impressed that my little cart actually fits that many books on it. And yeah, in brief, to go over the numbers, there were 2 books on this list that I read. There were 10 books on the list that are unread that I still own, and I unhauled 19 of the books off this list. So quite impressive, which I guess to me means I do have a pretty good idea of what books I would and would not want. So that leaves me with the 10 books that are still here and figuring out what I want to do with those. So here they are. Here are the 10 books that I still have left that are unread, that are still going to go on my bookshelves. And yeah, I need to kind of reconsider a few of them. So in the month of December, these 10 books will in some way have a spot on my TBR game. And so there will be a chance that I will read one or multiples of these in the month of December. We'll see how that goes and if that happens. And if not, I will have to decide, are these truly bomb books? Do I actually just want to unhaul them because I have had a year and haven't gotten to them and have been avoiding them? Or are they books that maybe, you know, how I have considered for the last year and am still interested in reading them. I don't know, we'll see. I will definitely do an update on that by the end of December or the beginning of the new year, because I do like the idea of this and seeing how it works out over the year. So I'm pretty sure in 2025, even if I don't make a card of it, I am definitely going to pick books off my shelf again to consider unhauling if I don't read them. So let me know if there's any books in this stack that you really think I need to hold on to and just take my time and eventually get to. Or let me know if there's books where you're like, no, let it go, girl. Like, stop pretending it's not worth it. I've read it. You hate it. Whatever. All right. And that's it for today. And I will talk to you next time. Bye.